Hello, everyone. Thank you for making the time to join us for our NDEWS Presents webinar today. The Coordinating Center for the National Drug Early Warning System is sponsored by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and we are pleased to welcome you to this webinar. The NDEWS PI, Dr. Eric Wish, and our NIDA project scientist, Moira O'Brien, are in the audience with us today. My name is Erin Artijani, and Barbara Kerr, Marwa Al-Nasir, and I will be the facilitators for this webinar. We are all a part of the NDEWS Coordinating Center team. For those who are interested, you can find detailed information about NDEWS, recordings of prior webinars, and invitations to future webinars on our website at www.ndews.org. You will also find instructions for how to join our NDEWS network and participate in ongoing discussions with more than 1,700 experts and concerned citizens from across the United States and many other countries. NDEWS operates as part of a large university, and that gives us the ability to draw on a diverse array of experts. So we have worked with experts in the study of language and geospatial analysis. Today, we are investigating the ability to use big data collected from Twitter to discover new drug synonyms. And this afternoon, we are very fortunate to be joined by our research collaborators from the Center for Advanced Study of Language, or CASEL, at the University of Maryland. Dr. Claudia Brugman is CASEL's Technical Director for Language and Social Systems, and Dr. Nikki Adams is an Assistant Research Scientist at CASEL. This webinar will be approximately 60 minutes long, and we encourage you to submit questions during and after the presentation. Please use the Q&A box to submit your question in writing rather than raising your hand. Our panelists, Barbara, Marwa, and I, will do our best to get to all of your questions. We will also, if necessary, post a transcript of the Q&A with responses to all the questions submitted, along with a full recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides used by our presenters on our website, www.ndews.org. During their presentation today, Dr. Brugman and Dr. Adams will be telling you about their analysis of big data collected through Twitter. This research is continuing as part of a diversity supplement that was awarded to NDEWS and Dr. Adams, who will be branching on from Twitter to look at other potential forums such as Reddit. Thank you again. We appreciate you joining us today, and we hope you enjoy this webinar.
Talk to you today about past and ongoing research on discovery of drug terms through social media using natural language processing. And our first slide has our research collaborators on it as well. Dr. Tom Connors, Sean Simpson, and Adam Leiter were part of the research team that worked on this over the last year and a half or so. So we became involved in this work because we learned of CESAR and NDEWS's research efforts, including the ones that explore questions of how social media communications can contribute to the early warning system. The NDEWS project funded exploratory work to use the Twitter corpus that they had collected to investigate this question. And so we brought our own perspective from theoretical linguistics to this problem, asking the question, can we bring our knowledge of language use and natural language processing to bear on the language of drug use? So just an overview of what CASEL is. Thank you, Erin, for the introduction. The Center for Advanced Study of Language is the only social science UARC in the country. UARCs, university-affiliated research centers, are intended to serve research needs supporting U.S. government interests. CASEL's ambit, CASEL was founded in about 2002. Its ambit of government service is directed primarily at analyzing language materials for under-resourced and strategically important languages, as well as improving and assessing language and other education and training programs for the U.S. government. So we have a staff of people, not just linguists, but education people, psychologists, and computer scientists. So more recently, CASEL has expanded its portfolio to partner with industry and other institutions that don't necessarily have U.S. government needs in their focus. And I think our collaboration with CESAR has been a very productive early instance of this new expansion.
So before we describe the work that we've done, I just want to try to situate everyone in the broader research using social media for the purpose of investigating public health. So there have been several topics of investigation in epidemiology. A couple famous ones have to do with tracking flu trends on Twitter. This was done in Japan and also in the US. More recently, there's been some work correlating heart disease mortality, even down to the county level, with a precision that exceeds what they were able to get by using more traditional demographic measures like socioeconomic measures or obesity measures. And you'll notice that, that even some of this earlier work is only maybe 6-7 years old. It's kind of a new field, but it's really taken off in the last few years. And all of these references will be on a slide once these slides go up on the website so that everyone's able to look up this research and read for yourselves if you want. And that includes a paper on this research that we will talk about that will appear in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, Public Health and Surveillance. It's in press. We expect that to come out in the next issue.
Maybe in the next issue.
We thought it was going to come out this issue, but probably in the next issue. So continuing on, there's also been research in the areas of pharmacovigilance, in particular with respect to adverse drug reactions. So a lot of research on this, just looking at drugs and how, because they know that people underreport adverse drug reactions. So seeing if they can investigate this topic on social media and get more information about it that way. And in toxicovigilance, most closely related to this topic, there's been lots of work on prescription medication abuse. There's been lots of work on marijuana and related substances like edibles and what's it called? Concentrates. Also some work on tracking food poisoning, even on Twitter, because that too is often underreported, and you know, people just miss out on that data. So these are just some examples of public health research using social media. The corpora, and by corpora I just mean a large body of text to be analyzed, and right now it is mostly text. We do know in the field that there are other types of data that can be looked at, like images, audio, but for the most part it's still text. So the corpora that have been investigated can be general, like Twitter or Instagram, which cover all topics, anything anybody wants to talk about, or they can be specific. For example, there's been some research on Daily Strength, which is an online support group, or it can use Yelp. Some of the food poisoning research has been using Yelp, and Yelp is, as you know, only for reviews of retailers, of businesses. And corpora can be processed in a number of ways or not. We did minimal processing for reasons that we can talk about maybe in the Q&A session if people are interested, but it can be filtered by keyword. Most of the research that has been done for public health on Twitter has been done on filtered Twitter. So you filter the tweets by keyword, and you look at only the tweets that contain one of your keywords. It can be, the corpus can be compiled just from specific subforums. So we'll talk later about some expansion into Reddit, and Reddit is divided into subforums. You can process the actual data. You can stem it, so you change the actual form of the words. And this is like, say, taking off affixes, so that jumping, jumped, jumps, all, which have the same stem, can all be sort of collapsed. Or you can kind of expand the form or the information for the form by tagging it for part of speech. So for example, if you have some part of speech tagger, you can get, say, the string blow, and you can have it tagged for noun or verb, depending on what the machine thinks it is in that particular context. And that particular word, in the case of, say, investigating drugs, below the noun is much more likely to be related to terminology about drugs than below the verb. Okay, the means of investigation, or the methods, can be entirely manual, so you can have people, just humans involved. So a human can filter filter Twitter by keywords, look at only the tweets with their eyeballs. You can have semi-supervised or supervised machine learning, where humans interact with the machine. So you say humans take some data, and a human, for example, can classify instances of the use of Molly as being related to drugs or just being someone's name. And then this data can then be given to a machine, so the machine can learn the difference between drug and non-drug Molly. And then from that point, you can have a machine process a lot more data than a human could, or it could be a completely unsupervised method. And the method that we will talk about here is unsupervised. So that means that no humans altered the data that the machine had to learn from. As for the topic that we will report on, as far as we know, we are the only ones who have investigated this topic. So this is using social media for the purpose of discovering new drug-related terminology.
So we stepped into this project in process. NDEWS researchers had already been doing human analysis of social media of the kind that Nikki talked about, just eyeballing tweets to see whether they could discover any trends. That's a very sophisticated but very labor-intensive method for doing epidemiological research. They originally collaborated with people in the information school at University of Maryland to take an important first step to take advantage of big data NLP analysis methods as applied to Twitter's enormous volume and its metadata, in particular, the geographic origin of the tweet. So we'll show you how big the volume can be. Human methods simply weren't being effective, so big data NLP analyses made sense as a next step. Filtering by keyword, as Nikki mentioned, as a method, has a fairly serious limitation to do public health social media research, and we'll talk about some of the associated issues in the next slide or two. So in particular, in the cases that we looked at as part of our initiation into this project, we noticed that the keywords that were being focused on as a filtration device were terms that were either standard or clinical terms, and we knew that that meant that a lot of the ordinary everyday communications about drugs and drug practices were being missed because the terms were not going through this filtration. They were not being used as keywords. We also learned as part of this work that published lists of everyday words or what's often called drug slang may be 2 or more years old. So we thought, as part of the question of early warning, can we find terms that are more current? So we thought about our contribution to this as linguists, to just think about Twitter as this huge corpus for linguistic research. By variationists there, I just mean that as linguists, we acknowledge that people use language differently in all kinds of different media. So we took it out as a hypothesis that we would be able to find some points of difference in the medium of Twitter and related social media. We have proven by our own work and the work cited here that people don't use language in the same way in social media as in other written sources. And in fact, they don't use different social media, they don't use language in different social media the same way either. Our background knowledge as language experts tell us that 3 states go together: taboo substances or practices, the social groups that engage in those practices, and a specialized vocabulary used by members of those groups. So this is what's referred to as drug slang or argot. And we hypothesized that the instant broad reach of social media would only speed up the rise and fall of new terms by these specialized groups. So the fact that the drug slang lists might be 2 years old meant that they might essentially be useless for epidemiological applications. So we asked the question, if we step back and find a method that reveals new terms used by people engaging in these practices, can we provide a stronger empirical base to do the communication analyses for early warning? So we took our job as to be in the intersection of these 2 problem spaces: early response to drug behaviors and language use. So what we hope to show is that big data methods can not only analyze a huge amount of data, but it can analyze it in such a way as to reveal terms not known to drug researchers through more standardized or more technical means of communication. And this is, as we said, a step beyond most big data analyses, which take the vocabulary as given. So we hoped it would improve the accuracy of drug identification for people involved in responses to drug behaviors. So our questions included these: is Twitter a valid medium? What kinds of automated methods can accurately discover these new terms? And we knew that we were walking into a common space of vocabulary shift. So when new terms come up, they come up in one of 4 ways. You might have a new term for an old substance. You might use an existing term for an old substance. You may invent a term for a new substance, or you may use an existing term in a new way to refer to a new substance. So these are 4 different combinations of the referent and the referring term. And so both kinds of semantic broadening or shift result in lexical ambiguity, which is one of the problems that we've had mixed success with in using the method that we're going to describe.
Okay, so just to reiterate on that last point, it turns out for this method that finding completely new terms that don't mean anything else other than drugs was relatively successful. But finding terms that can mean multiple things, including drugs, was a bit more of a challenge. Okay, so I'm going to describe the general method, and again, the details on this can be found when that journal piece comes out. Okay. What we will use is something referred to as a vector space model. And since we are doing it at the level of the word or a phrase, it's commonly referred to as word embeddings. If you want to go out there and see what people are talking about for this particular method, you can search for word embeddings. And it involves the understanding that a word is defined by its context. And by context here, what we just mean is what words occur around it, what words occur to the left or the right of whatever words you happen to be investigating. Sorry, getting a little too comfortable and leaning out of the window here. And so there's an example of Molly, and we keep bringing this one up, but it was because it was one of the terms that we investigated, and it is ambiguous between a name and a way of referring to NDMA. You as a human can see that the first two examples are unambiguous. The Molly I took last night was terrible. Names in English are not preceded by the. That's an instant clue, even if you don't know much about the meaning of the words. Just the fact that there's a the there will tell you that it's not a person. Did you watch Molly dance? I don't think drugs dance, but I'm still learning. And what was the context that you made for this last bullet?
Oh, did you all go to the movies? Oh, we all went to the movies last night. Oh, did you take Molly?
Right, so sometimes as potential synonyms were coming up in our investigation, we might pull actual tweets to look and see what was going on in them. And sometimes they would be clear to us and sometimes they would be ambiguous. Okay. Okay. A graphic. This graphic is not real, but it's an illustration of the general concept of the way words are mapped into vector space. This looks like a three-dimensional space. Actually, for our models, we used 200 dimensions, which is a normal number, usually 2 to 500 I see in research of this sort. So this is obviously a simplification, and again, not real data, but the point is to illustrate that words that are similar to one another should occur close to one another in vector space. And so the idea here is that these marijuana terms are related to one another and to the words smoke and high in a particular way, and maybe less so to the word gas in a particular way, as opposed to these car terms or words related to cars, which are related to one another and to gas and to high in a particular way, and maybe not to smoke, because cars have high RPMs, I think was supposed to be the idea. We did learn, in fact, after this graphic was created, that gas is a way of referring to marijuana. But anyway, the point is just to illustrate the mapping of words in vector space. Okay, so vector space models. Spatial relationships and code semantic relationships. And this can be, you can sort of test how robust of a model you've created through a kind of semantic vector algebra. And that is how we tested, and I will explain shortly, how much time we needed to build a robust model. Because as Claudia mentioned, one of the key points we were looking at was if we could shorten the amount of time it takes to detect a new term that has arisen. It's really less so about time than it is about data, but the corpus we had was a like 1% general Twitter corpus, 1% of Twitter's feed. So of that 1%, how much time does it take to get enough data to build a robust model? And this is how we answered that question. A model that is robust should be able to tell you how words relate to one another through analogies even. So you can ask the model, if I tell you to map the relationship of woman and man, and then I give you queen, can you give me something that is mapped to queen in the same way that man is mapped to woman? And so it should return king. And the best models will do so, and those that are not so good will not.
Go back.
Oh.
So just,
yeah.
just to tie the bow here, we tested the robustness of the model for the particular set of questions we were asking by testing it on drug-related analogy diagnostics. So this was something that we added as a testing method. Alcohol is to drink as marijuana, and that should return smoke. So that's the means of ingestion. And alcohol is to drunk as to marijuana. That should return stoned or high. So the relationship is between the substance and the resulting state.
Right. Thanks. Okay, and so I'll carry on with that explanation, but just to interject here, some of the challenges that came up as we were doing this research is that people talk about everything in their lives on Twitter. That is one of the reasons people generally filter Twitter by keywords. But since the whole point of this research was to try to discover unknown terms, it didn't make sense for our particular project to filter anything, because then you would only be looking at tweets that contain terms you already know. So that would defeat the purpose. I think some of these challenges have already been mentioned, but one I just want to point out again is the candy problem in that second bullet. So it's a problem that weed is ambiguous, and it's a problem that Molly is ambiguous, because outside of some particular type of pre-processing the data, the machine doesn't know when it sees different meanings of weed or Molly. So it builds a context for weed or Molly, whether it means weed, the plants that are destroying your garden, or weed marijuana. But it turned out actually in Twitter that most mentions of weed and most mentions of Molly were actually drug related. This was not the case for candy. Most mentions of candy were not drug related. They were about the actual delicious, sugary, sweet thing that you eat. And therefore, what the machine learned about the term candy is that it is primarily about delicious sweets and not about drugs in pill form. And so, yeah, like as I mentioned, we call this the candy problem.
And just again, the reason it makes it difficult to discover this through a vector space model is that the meaning of candy as drug and the meaning of candy as sweet thing, those contexts are going to be mixed up in the model in the same, as if they were about the same word. Okay, so an overview, and I'll actually go through this pretty quickly because, as I said, the details will be in the article.
but the Twitter data was extracted, filtered only by geographic location, so just meaning for the US, not filtered by keyword. So just for the US and just for English. And we did some very light cleaning of the data. Then, in order to answer the question of how much data does it take to build a robust model, we created 3 test corpora. One consisted of all the data that can be gathered in 1 week. One was for 1 month, and another was for 3 months. Just to give you an idea of the volume, this is the number of tweets and the number of tokens, and here tokens just means words. It might mean words and
it means word instances and.
I was trying to think if it was words and 2-word phrases, but I think actually this is just the number of just individual words. So how many words are in 1% collection of Twitter feed in a month, or 3 months, or 1 week. And going back to that discussion of the analogy, so you will remember that we said the analogies was how we tested the robustness of the model. And in particular, there was an already released large set of analogies that one could use that were more general, but we looked most closely at the ones that we had developed for drugs, drug processes, and drug states we divided them as. And as you can see, the 1 week model was worse than the 1 month and the 3 months, but the 1 month and the 3 months were the same. So that indicated to us that 1 week's worth of data was insufficient, but 1 month was sufficient, and you didn't need to go on to 3 months. So you didn't need to wait 3 months to collect enough data to get a robust model. Then we queried the models built from this data with words we already know to get back. So again, just to clarify, the way this works is you build the model, you give it this data, it builds a model that understands how words are related to one another based on the words that occur around them. And the way that you query it is you give it some words you know, and what it gives back to you are other words that occur in similar contexts. So we queried the model to get possible synonyms, and we just decided on a cutoff for success as being a cosine similarity of 0.5. So identity would be 1, and completely different non-overlapping context would be -1. There's no exact measure of what is a good amount of cosine similarity to say 2 words are similar. For this pilot, we just said 0.5, and actually we changed the criteria for that later on in the research. But on the research we reported on now, that's how we decided whether something was closely related. If it had a cosine similarity of at least 0.5 or greater, at least 0.5, to the query that you initially gave it. So the drugs that we looked at were MDMA and marijuana in consultation with CESAR. So for MDMA, we obtained a list, or we asked them to obtain a list for us. This was a list of slang terms that experts across the country had identified. We decided to use ecstasy and Molly as the 2 terms that we would give the model to see what it gave back to us. And as I mentioned, it was considered successful if given one of those target terms, the model is able to discover other terms on the list provided to us by CESAR and its experts. And those terms had a cosine similarity to the target of at least 0.5. And even better, if given those target terms, ecstasy or Molly, the model was able to provide to us terms that were not on the list, right? Because ultimately that was the goal, was to discover new terms. So the results for MDMA, so they had a list of 38 possible ways of referring to MDMA supplied to us by CESAR and its experts. 19 of these were not mentioned on Twitter at all. So they were just not even in the corpus to be returned or not returned. So we sort of just left these out of the remainder of the analysis. Of the rest, 16 of them were mentioned on Twitter, but were not closely related to the target terms by the criteria we define, which is that cosine similarity of 0.5 or greater. And that's those in this first table here: candy, speed, and so forth. 5 of these had a few mentions on Twitter, overwhelmingly not MDMA, and 3 of them were returned as close related to one another. So if you enter ecstasy, then you get back Molly, and if you enter Molly, you get back ecstasy, and if you enter MDMA, you get back Molly and ecstasy. Those 3 kept coming up. So why did so many of the terms provided to us by CESAR, even when they were being mentioned on Twitter, didn't show up as being closely related to the key terms, ecstasy and Molly? Low incidence versus high incidence. So as I mentioned before, sometimes we then take the tweets and we look at them to see what is actually going on. We had, is this 1 or 2 annotators? Okay, Claudia was one of the annotators. Look at up to 200, if there were 200 tweets that contained the term provided to us by CESAR, and annotate whether that term was being used in a way to refer to drugs or not. And so you see that for MDMA, ecstasy, and Molly at the top, they are used to refer to the drug at a relatively high rate. Actually, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I said Molly most of the time is used to refer to drugs. Not most of the time, just enough.
37%.
Just enough. 30, yeah, at least of these 200 that we sampled, as opposed to everything else from the list provided to us by CESAR, which is rarely used to refer to drugs. And so the model just could not essentially detect a drug type context for these terms. So the results for MDMA show some of the limitation of the model. It needs to be used to talk about drugs on Twitter at a fairly high frequency in order for it to show up as being related to other drug terms. Marijuana was more successful. So out of the 28 slang terms that we received from CESAR and its Sentinel sites, we used 3 as the query targets, the ones we would give the model to see what it gave back. All of the words that they gave us had been mentioned on Twitter. 17 of them were mentioned, but not selected as being closely related, again, by that criterion of 0.5 cosine similarity or higher. And 11 of those 28 were mentioned and were closely related by that criterion. And my picture is covering up some of the table, but okay. Thanks. And so we did the same thing. We pulled 200 tweets as a sample, and had a couple of annotators go through them and annotate how often they are used to refer to drugs. Animated slide, yes. And so here are the 11 or 13 that came back as closely related to either weed, marijuana, or ganja. And you can see again that the frequency with which they are used to refer to drugs is above that approximately 30% threshold. So that seemed to be a real and consistent thing in this investigation. The model also returned tweets that were not supplied by CESAR experts. This doesn't mean that they didn't necessarily know them, it just means that they happen to not write them down on the list, but still, that is success. Obviously, everyone knows cannabis, but PAC came up, PACC, which is a spelling variation of PAC, loud PAC, and the variant is specific to
Los Angeles.
Is it just Los
Angeles? We thought so.
It's
Southern California.
Okay, it's to avoid the CK spelling, which could stand for Crip Killer. So if you are in this gang, then you do not want to use certain letter combinations that identifies you as belonging to one gang or another. Okay, also some synthetic marijuana terms came up, and also paraphernalia related to marijuana came up.
Okay, so we considered this to be a moderate success. The question, given target terms, is our model able to predict less frequent or less mainstream terms as provided by the CESAR sentence site experts? And the answer was, if the term has a drug relevancy of about 30% or greater, the model will return that term. So it does have to have a certain currency in the population in order for the model to find it in its drug relevant meaning. And again, is the model able to predict terms that are actually not known to experts? And the answer again is yes, but those terms have to reach quite high relevancy in order for the model to recognize them as being part of this drug vocabulary. The third question, we had used Twitter because it was, the Twitter corpus had already been developed as the sort of par excellence example of social media. And so we raised the question, is Twitter an effective medium for analysis for new terms, discovery of new terms? And the answer is qualified yes. We did try many substances that we haven't reported on here, and heroin and methamphetamine we didn't get anywhere with it. And our hypothesis is that people simply don't talk about those things on Twitter. Therefore, there's no data to be analyzed.
Yes, or at a greatly reduced frequency, and we would just have to substantially modify the approach we talked about here in order to detect potential synonyms for these categories.
So we've gone through the limitations as we've gone along with the analysis. Twitter is a very noisy corpus, and by that we mean that people talk about too many things that aren't drugs to give us a nice concentrated but high volume corpus. So the candy problem remains unsolved, because if people are talking about real candy more than they're talking about their prescription drugs using the word candy, it's just not determinable through this method. The substance issue, there are limitations there based on people's communication behaviors. It's not necessarily a limitation of the model. So the assumption that Twitter's huge volume gives us good fodder for big data analysis is only partly true, particularly in this sort of specialized study. But there are people who are dealing with this in new ways. So, and another thing that has been leveled at us in the past is because the model only recognizes words or maybe two-word or three-word phrases, we don't actually know the meaning. So the terms really don't tell you what they're meaning. They just tell you that they're meaning something that's relevant for a subsequent human analysis.
Right, so they all require vetting by an expert. And we always knew this and anticipated this, but at least one, maybe two of the reviewers for the article we mentioned would have liked the world to be such that this method could discover new drug terms without any human intervention, including any human vetting, but I just don't think we're at that point yet.
All right, so our success is largely in the proof of concept area. So we did use the spectral space model. We discovered terms that were previously unknown, and by unknown we mean unknown as input to the model, so new to the model. Some of them were in fact new to the people involved, which we were pretty happy about. We showed that as little as 1 month's worth of Twitter data can give us good outcomes. And this means that the time gap between the introduction of a new term and us being able to discover it is pretty short. We found that there are some terms which are actually regional variants. So Nikki mentioned the PAC spelling as being an indicator not just of the substance, but of the particular group that was using this term. And it's somewhat unfortunate that marijuana and related concepts has the best success, because we think that's probably the problem of least concern to NDEWS researchers. It's not one that leads to large swaths of overdose deaths, for instance, but it is the one that people seem to have the most conversation about on Twitter, at least in our corpus at that time. And it also is one that has a large enough number of established slang terms that we were able to get contexts specific enough to reveal new slang terms from those.
Oh, one point that maybe we didn't mention is that when it comes to querying this model, that in fact, if what you want to discover is slang, the best thing to give the model as a query is another slang term. Ideally, an unambiguous slang term like
Ganja.
ganja.
Ganja's our favorite word now.
Right, because slang terms for a word and official terminology often occur in quite different contexts. So if you give it like an official term, very often what you get back are not slang terms. It can happen, but sometimes.
So just, this didn't rise to scientific significance, but I did a little corpus study of my own and revealed to myself that the words marijuana and cannabis were used mostly in discourse contexts talking about legislation and legal use, and weed and ganja and so on were much more frequently talked about in illicit contexts. So if you're using marijuana and cannabis as a way of revealing new terms, you're not going to get anywhere, because people aren't using those terms to talk about illicit practices.
Okay, so that covers most of the work that took place over the past year, actually ending sometime this summer. There are lots of ways to continue this work. There are lots of new approaches or modifications of the approach that we could try. We could, and are in fact, look at different social media platforms to see if they can reveal something that Twitter couldn't for us, or that unfiltered Twitter could not for us. And so I'm going to talk just about a little bit where that work is going now. So right now, we are working on broadening the corpora used. So towards the end of this last project, CASEL began looking at Reddit. The idea was that we didn't want to exactly filter by keyword for the reasons that I brought up earlier, which is we're looking for terms we don't know, so we don't want to look at only posts or tweets that contain terms we know. But we could narrow down the topic of conversation by using the subform structure in Reddit. So looking at only the subforms that had to do with drugs, and that this would cut down on the noise in the data without bringing up that issue of filtering by keywords. The results from the models that we built from these Reddit subforums seem to indicate that would be a more successful approach to this task. And that is where the work is going right now. And also in particular for discussion on opioids, there's at least seem to be a lot more discussion on Reddit about opioids. So there was a piece in the New York Times over this past summer about a particular subforum that was used to help people solicit, I think, solicit these drugs. So for the current work, the method staying primarily the same, the vector space modeling. I have not yet pre-processed the data further, but I might. Right now I'm looking at Twitter and Reddit as corpora of comparison, and possibly also having a third corpus that is Twitter filtered by keyword. And I'm looking at opioids in greater detail than we did in the previous work. So I've collected subforms that have to do with marijuana, which there are a lot, and those that have to do with opioids, of which there are also a lot, but not as many, and a few other drug subreddits, subforums. And I'm comparing 3-month slices from Reddit, unfiltered Twitter, and in the process of creating that corpus of Twitter filtered by keywords. The reason I'm doing 3 months, even though we just told you that you only need 1 month's worth of data, is because the Reddit data for the subforms is so much smaller than the Twitter data that 1 month of Reddit data for just the subforums is not enough to build a robust model. So you need at least, it seems you need at least 3 months work for those subforms for Reddit. So just to keep the time slices roughly equivalent, 3 months for Reddit, Twitter, and maybe in the future, Twitter filter by keyword. And Reddit is showing a greater percentage of targeted synonyms and a reduction in the noisiness without the filtering. And just as I think this is our final content slide, an example of what you get when you have 2 models, one built on the Twitter data, one built on the Reddit data, and you give it as a query 30s. Twitter will tell you that the most similar things are 20s, 40s, and the spelled out version of 20s and the spelled out version of 30s, and so forth, while Reddit will tell you that the most similar things are 10s and blues and 20s and Roxy's And these are all for, I guess, the milligrams,
The
micrograms,
dosage, yeah.
the dosage for opioids. So just an example of how the Reddit corpus is more targeted and is likely, I think, to lead to more success for this task. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Brugman and Dr. Adams. That was really a very interesting presentation and a great overview of the work you've been doing. And I'm happy to report that we did get some questions in, which I will share with you now. And I would also ask folks that you stick around, because I want to make sure that I tell you about our upcoming webinar and share some other information with you as well. There we go. And so our next webinar will be part 4 in our ongoing series, where we have been exploring monitoring systems in other parts of the world to see what we could learn about how folks in other places monitor and detect what's going on in their areas. And this one will feature an expert from the EMCDDA, the European Monitoring Center on Drugs and Drug Addiction. And she will hopefully be talking about some of the new reports and methodologies that they've been working on there, like the trend spotting methodology that they use, for instance, to do a more in-depth investigation of a particular drug in a particular place, and their European drug report for 2017, which is currently available on their website. So I'm going to switch over to the questions now, and I also want to say, again, thank you to our researchers, and fortunately, Dr. Adams was successful in getting a diversity supplement from NIDA, and that's what she's going to be using to pursue her research with Reddit and some of the other things she discussed at the end of her presentation. And so our first question is from an attendee, and I think you kind of covered it during your presentation. You mentioned using 1% of Twitter in your analysis. This is many millions of tweets. Is that correct?
That's right.
That is correct. And let's see, I think I have the slide here with the exact numbers, but 1% Twitter feed for 1 month gives you about 75 million tweets and about 784 million words.
All right, thank you. Then we have a question from a fellow researcher who wants to know, what kind of embedding did you use? GloVe, Word2, Vec, or did you generate something of your own?
We use Word2Vec. GenSim's Word2Vec.
Okay, thank you. And another one of our viewers wanted to know if the model that you were using considers spelling variations for key terms. So for instance, if someone spelled Molly, M-O-L-L-I-E instead of Y, or if they had a bunch of Y's at the end or something like that, would your model detect that?
So one way that you can pre-process data is to do some kind of spelling normalization and sort of get all of those words to be spelled the same and treated the same. But we did not do that for the very reason that we consider these spelling variations might actually mean something different. So
we know that weed spelled with 3 or 4 E's is never going to refer to the thing that ruins your garden. So we actually took those spelling variants as meaningful information. We knew that it might not emerge in the model, but we felt that normalizing or pre-processing those spellings would have the potential of losing important information for us.
All right, thank you. And the next question is from a viewer who wants to know if your model picks up key terms that are embedded in a hashtag.
Yes, that is actually one way of pre-processing the data that I have been considering but have not done. So as far as the model knows, weed and hashtag weed are 2 different words. They're closely related words, but they are 2 different words.
Okay, thank you. And another viewer wanted to know a little bit more about what was included in the corpus that you used. So for instance, did you exclude certain kinds of users, like people who are medical or educational or news users, or certain types of tweets excluded, like if somebody was retweeting a news story, for example, or something like that?
I think that for the pilot, we did exclude retweets.
We did.
But other than that, we didn't exclude anything. And perhaps in the future, if there's time and I'm successful at like using some of the software out there for bot detection, maybe we will exclude bots.
We did exclude bots.
Did we?
We excluded bots from 2 well-known sources.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So a little bit,
We
but
swept away some of the bots.
yeah. But for the most part, no.
Okay. And then I had a question from a viewer who seemed to be interested in possibly setting up a collaboration with us. He wanted to know if the corpus was available for others to use and that kind of thing. So I just sent you a text back to please email me offline at my email address, eartigia@umd.edu, because we're always happy to discuss potential collaborations and explore other ideas. So please get in touch with me and we'll set up a separate meeting to have that conversation. And here we have a question. How did you tokenize multi-word phrases?
So there is some bigram detection in the software we use, that Ginseng package that we were referring to earlier. But outside of that, outside of possible 2-word phrases, no phrases greater than that were grouped together. So everything is an individual word or a 2-word phrase. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. And one of our viewers wanted to know a little bit more about what you're thinking about doing with Reddit when you get started on that. And this person asks, are you using unsupervised methods to select your subreddits or selecting them based on expert review advice?
We are selecting them based on somewhat tedious search of the internet, because, yeah, if that viewer knows some clever way of detecting all of the related subreddits, then I would be really interested in hearing it. But otherwise, we just go to places where there are lists of related Reddits. Some person has posted list of related Reddits, and we might try to, just do some searching on our own.
Okay. Thank you. And do you expect the increased Twitter length to impact the amount of data needed for a robust model?
Perhaps. Indeed, the short number of characters, that 140 character byte, character limit, we do think impacts modeling of context, because there just isn't that much.
Yeah.
So we will see, but that is one of.
I know that when I was human annotating those samples for ambiguity, a lot of terms, we devised a protocol that determined certain tweets to be ambiguous because there was no disambiguating context, even though our gut told us this is a drug reference. We were erring on the side of caution. So for those cases where no context was provided, it just said, great Molly, or wonderful pack. We would expect that the opportunity to provide more context would give us a larger number of instances that were unambiguous. So that would probably impact the model in a positive way.
All right, thank you. We have a question here from a viewer who noticed that in your presentation you talked about synonyms, and she is wondering if your models could also be used to detect acronyms for drugs, such as M for Molly, used for purchasing drugs inconspicuously.
So I think one of our slides showed that X and E were returned as synonyms for Molly, but not with high enough relevancy to arise as synonyms. The model doesn't care how many letters a word has.
Okay.
So a one-letter word appearing in the right context should emerge if it appears with that meaning the appropriate percentage of the time. Right?
I think so. Now, like, now I'm asking myself, for that specific software, do they have some like minimum character length? If like one character is too short.
But we did get E and X back.
Yeah, so
Well,
must not be, must not be.
All right, thank you. And thank you everyone for hanging in with us. I know we've gone beyond 3 o'clock, but I do have a few more questions I was hoping to get to. And one you may not be ready to answer yet, but because you may not be far enough along with your work with Reddit, but one of our viewers wanted to know if you can name the most useful Reddit subforums relative to opioids.
Oh.
Have you formed any opinions on that?
Yeah, I don't know, especially since I haven't really investigated them individually. I've just sort of grouped them all together and taken all the data from all of them. That one in the New York Times piece, which is in our corpus, but has now been shut down, I guess wasn't particularly useful enough to attract attention and to get shut down, because I think Reddit's rules are that you are not allowed to solicit. But yeah, if that viewer really wants to know, I could maybe at least just look at number of subscribers and the number of posts in a particular subforum, and I could get back to them.
All right, thank you very much. And we have a question from a viewer who wants to know what NLP platform you used.
Do you mean which software we used?
That could be what she means. I read you the whole question, so that's all I've got.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what that means.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, the general method was word embeddings, and the software we used for it was Jensen's package.
Okay. So for this viewer, if that didn't answer your question adequately, you can also contact us offline, and we'll be happy to discuss it with you further. And let's see. Oh, I have one here that I want to make sure I get to that's from our colleague at the FDA. And he notes that the FDA has provided no draft guidance on managing Twitter from a PV perspective, and he wants to know if you have any recommendations for a PV group to manage tweets from Twitter. Or
is that pharmacovigilance? PV?
He does not. I guess what he's getting at with his question is he wonders if it's important to have live people reviewing tweets, or if it's possible to use a vendor who has software that can cone tweets for certain medical terms and that kind of thing.
Well, I guess it depends on the confidence that you have in the model you've built. So like for the food poisoning work that was done in Chicago that I mentioned a little bit earlier on in the slides, so they used a supervised method to train a classifier. They had humans look at tweets that contained some particular keyword and classify them as being likely instances of food poisoning or not. Then they had a machine learn the difference between that. And so the machine would be monitoring Twitter for those keywords, and then taking those tweets that were likely about food poisoning and passing those off to a human and then the human would evaluate basically whether they agreed with the machine, and if so, they might try to intervene, say by sending a tweet that contains a link to where you can report food poisoning. So, I mean, maybe there are few intelligent machines intelligent enough that humans feel confident enough that they can be doing things, especially intervention type things, without a human to watch.
Okay, and I think I have one last question for you here, and that is, you mentioned filtering by geographic region, I think, says one of our viewers, and if so, where did you focus? What particular geographical areas were you looking at?
So the initial focus, which was the constraint of NDEWS, because NDEWS is about the United States, was to filter out tweets that didn't originate in the continental US, approximately. We are very interested in regional differences in vocabulary use. Our method is very cumbersome when it comes to applying this at a regional level because of the volume issue. So if we were to filter out tweets in a particular region, the volume would have to be much, the time space would have to be much larger to approximate the volume that would be required for a robust model. And because we would have to do each of those regional models separately, we just didn't have the time to even test out what the relevant time slice would have to be to provide the right volume. So in principle, it's usable that way, but in with our small team of people doing very exploratory work, it's something that we pursued briefly, but we didn't get super high success with it, so we had to go on to other things.
Something we're interested in the future, and I think it was alluded to in the slide somewhere, that other people are exploring methods to sort of boost the amount of data, because some small, as Claudia said, if right now we say, okay, you need like 1 month worth of Twitter to build a robust model, but that's because you have a country's worth of data. If you only had a state's worth of data, we're not sure how many months that would take. However, there are other people doing work. All of our data actually was geotagged, but there are other people who are doing work on that start with a corpus that's geotagged and non, and they are able to estimate the geographic location of some tweets to a high enough degree of certainty that they can get a greater number of tweets per geographic location, such that it's enough data to build these kinds of models or whatever model.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and we appreciate all the questions that we received, and that was certainly a useful conversation and touched on some important points and clarifications. And so for those of you who are still with us, I want to just launch our poll. And so we would appreciate it if you would take a couple moments to answer our questions and help us figure out how to focus our webinars in the future and what topics you would be interested in hearing moving forward. And again, just to remind you, our next webinar coming up is Wednesday, November 29th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And that will be the 4th installment of our series examining global drug early warning systems. And this will focus on monitoring drug trends in Europe. And will feature an expert from EMC DDA. So we certainly hope you will be able to join us then. And we will, as usual, post an invitation on the NDEWS network. And so you'll be able to register through that in the coming days. And just again, to remind you, we will be making a complete recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides available on our NDEWS website, www.ndews.org. So if there's anything you wanted to be able to take a closer look at, you should be able to do it there. And also keep in mind that we are happy to continue our discussions offline with you about anything you'd like to talk about with this research that Dr. Brugman and Dr. Adams have been working on. And you can see their contact information on this slide. And just as a final reminder, mine is my first initial and part of my last name, EARTIGIA@umd.edu. So thanks again, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.